Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. I'm Lucy Taylor, a student ambassador for early years at App Education Online, and today along with our panel members we're going to be focusing on the early years sector and discussing the impact of Covid-19 on their skills development. On our panel today I'm joined by Konstantina Moustaka, who has been an early years practitioner for the past 16 years. She worked at a nursery school in Greece for 11 years and has been working at a nursery school in London for the past 6 years. Konstantina has a BA in psychology and an MA in early childhood studies and has had a great interest in staff and young children's mental health, as well as emotion coaching, emotion regulation, and emotional literacy in early years. And also Dr. Kate Highfield, who is an experienced teacher educator and researcher currently working with Early Childhood Australia as the General Manager of Professional Learning and Research Translation. Kate's work explores effective technology integration and use with a focus on potential impacts on learning, pedagogy and play. Kate has spent over 2 decades working as a classroom teacher and as a teacher educator and researcher at Australian universities. Kate's current research explores the impact of technology as a tool with young children, parents and educators, an area that came into focus during Covid-19 in the Australian context. Welcome to you all and thank you for taking the time to join us today and sharing your valuable experiences. For those of you watching us live on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. If we have time at the end of the discussion, we will look to answer any questions you may have, so go ahead and type any questions you may have in the chat. The first question I have is, what impact has the pandemic had on maintaining existing skills within the early years sector? Konstantina, if I can come to you first, what impact do you think the pandemic had on maintaining existing skills within the early years sector?
Thank you, Lucy. Just to say hello to you and hello to Kate, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about early years and about our skills and development. Thank you. So this pandemic was completely unexpected, I guess, for everyone. And for us in early years, it felt like a hurricane. It took everything away. From one day to another, everything changed. We are always putting the safety of the children first. And when the pandemic started, this became even more important. So in my opinion, all skills related to keeping children safe, such as health and safety and safeguarding, were not only maintained during that period, but they were also developed through training. It was a priority also for new staff who, because of the lockdown, some of them did not have the opportunity to do such training on site, so they had the opportunity now to do it remotely. Mm-hmm. During the furlough last March and until June, we were encouraged in my nursery, the nursery I'm working currently, by our owner to do more training. For me personally, as a practitioner, it kept me going during these times. It was really important for me. I probably did more training during these 2.5 months than I have ever done before, because there was more time, I guess. And in our profession, where we are always used to work really hard and being all the time with the children, for the biggest part of our day, suddenly being at home for such a long time was completely unfamiliar and strange in a way. So after the reopening in June, policies and procedures changed, apparently in order to keep everyone safe. And then we concentrated 100% on the children's feelings and emotions. I mean, us as practitioners, at least. We also did important training, such as updating our first aid certificates, because some of them were already due, and in the meantime there was no training, so we had to do it when we came back. Hygiene trainings, etc. But definitely much less, I have to say, since there was less time now for that, due to also the decrease in staff and all of those things happening with the pandemic. There were people missing. We had to figure out how to work out staffing in the nursery. Now, the National Day Nursery Association, which is in early years, conducted a survey during that period in February, actually, with 445 settings. And the findings show that 96% of those settings continued to offer CPD opportunities to staff, most of them for first aid, safeguarding and infection prevention and control training. There was, I think this was the priority for everyone. And because these are definitely very challenging time for owners, for nursery owners, since some of them are also struggling financially now. And that instability definitely affects the training provision. There is also the fact that in-house training in some places is not even possible. The space is not enough. Mm-hmm. In large chains and in bigger nurseries, you might have the opportunity to spread people around, like have a lot more space between them and bring someone in to keep everyone safe. In smaller nurseries, this cannot happen. So this is something we need to consider for the future as well, I think. And it is also important to mention in terms of training that the Public Health England has created a free psychological first aid children and young people. And the government is also now offering level 3 courses for free to unqualified staff, which I think is also really important. Yes, if you haven't done any other level 3 in your life, let's say, or any other qualification before, you can definitely do it for free, join in and do it for free. So they have a list on the government site with places, universities, colleges that you can go and ask for that, for information about that. And finally, it is worth mentioning that there are many amazing and qualified people in the early years sector who are offering CPD opportunities for free, webinars, discussions, as the one we have now, I guess, like opportunities to exchange experiences, knowledge, talk about our sector and all the things that are happening at the moment, and then learn from each other, because these are hard times that we're going through, and having each other, I think, is really important, supporting each other in any way we can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now coming to Kate, you're also based in Sydney. What impact has the pandemic had on maintaining existing skills within the early years sector in Australia and beyond, if you're able to comment on that?
Thanks so much, Lucy. Konstantina, again, it's beautiful to meet you. Thank you so much. And I just want to start by thanking AP Education for facilitating today's conversation. And I'd love to hear your questions in the chat box. So if you are joining us online, would be great to hear from you. I'm at an organisation called Early Childhood Australia. It's a peak body for early childhood educators. And in Australia, that's anyone who works with children from birth to 8 years of age. As we begin today, as is an Australian tradition, I need to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which I stand. I'm in Canberra, so on Ngunnawal lands. But I also want to acknowledge the storm we've been having. And Konstantina, you mentioned COVID as just completely changing our lives. I think for me, I love to conceptualize it as a storm that's traveled around the world. And some countries are still right in the middle of that storm. You know, I think as we speak today of my colleagues in India who are just having such a challenging time. In Australia, we're an island nation, and we had many of our borders closed and a very strong quarantine experience. And so our experience of COVID is very different to the experiences of COVID around the world. For example, in Australia, the area that had the longest lockdown was 111 days, which is not very long. That 111 days was in Melbourne, but even during that time, many early childhood education and care services remained open. They were able to remain open for essential workers and children who had identified needs. So I say that by way of contextualizing that in Australia we've had a different experience so far to, say, you, Konstantina, in the UK, or our colleagues in Italy and in India as we speak. Having said all of that, though, I can definitely say that we've had some significant changes to the skills of existing staff members. For example, our face-to-face events, conferences, training days have predominantly stopped. Our restrictions on having the numbers of people in the room are based on space measurements, which, just as Konstantina said, that there's a restriction around having those face-to-face things. It's also really hard to present if you're wearing a mask, which is what we did for a period of time. Having said that, it has, this pandemic has really pushed some innovations. For example, in Australia, we have a significant uptake of online professional learning, whether that be synchronous professional learning, like the one we're doing now, where we all join in together, or asynchronous, that's where people who join later or watch at their own space and time. We're seeing that both of those types of online professional learning have increased significantly. I would say, though, that I recognise around the world that this has had a huge impact on our mental health, on our well-being, and that we are all experiencing, or many of us are experiencing, COVID fatigue, whether that's because you've been working from home and trying to be a parent to your children at the same time as work, at the same time as do our regular health things, or whether that's because your social life has been restricted. All of those strategies for educator wellbeing, for our resilience, have been significantly inhibited here. And I do just want to say that for me, when we look at workforce skills, having a foundation of wellbeing, being mentally well, being mentally healthy, is fundamental. It's very hard to learn something new if you're feeling depressed, challenged, feeling under significant pressure. And I recognise that that pressure is financial, it's emotional, it's confinement, it's social. There are so many levels to the way this pandemic has impacted on our mental health. Just like Konstantina in Australia, some of our free professional learning programs have just taken on significantly. You know, 4 years ago, educators were reluctant to be online, and now we see educators joining in webinars with 10,000 people quite happily. In Australia, we have an amazing wellbeing program for Australian educators called BU, and that's available for educators in early years and in schools. And the BU engagement increased, just as Konstantina said, during that time, because while we had staff not able to be in their service, or fewer children, so greater opportunities for staff to engage, we certainly saw an uptake in that online professional learning.
Thank you. And the second question is, how does the early years sector maintain a competitive workforce as restrictions are slowly eased? Okay, if I can turn to you first.
Oh, thanks, Lucy. Workforce is such a big issue in the early years sector. We, in Australia at least, have a shortage of early years educators. And when you think about workforce, there is a number of different factors, but you can really simplify it down to two key elements. The first one is keeping the staff who are in your workforce happy, engaged, and staying in the services. And the second one is making sure that you have a pipeline of quality staff coming through. And in this period of time, both of those have been significantly impacted. So we've seen large numbers of staff, and this is in Australia and in the US. I think the Washington Post last year reported that in a period of 2 months, 336,000 early childhood educators in America lost their jobs. That's really significant. So we've seen that people are leaving the sector, whether that's because there's been a financial pressure in their provider or their service closed, or whether that's because they're finding this workload and they're balancing their mental health so challenging. it's quite a period of trauma. And so we have to acknowledge that trauma is going to impact on people staying in the workforce. But then we've also seen, as you too, Lucy, are seeing, significant challenges to students who are coming through the pipeline. So in Australia, you have to do between 50 and 80 days of placement in a service, depending on your degree or your diploma qualification. So 15 through to 80 is a lot of time in a service. And if the service has stopped having visitors allowed in, then that's going to significantly slow down your opportunity to continue through your program. I do want to call out a couple of things though, and that's that we've seen some lovely innovations. For example, Carolyn Scott and her colleagues at Victorian University in Australia has done a remote placement in early childhood education, which has really been a remarkable innovation and changed some of the ways that that students have been able to engage with children. So there are some really interesting stories emerging of how that workforce pipeline, it sounds a terrible way to describe it, isn't it? But that workforce pathway, perhaps is a better way to put it, has been developing.
Konstantina, how do you see the early years sector maintaining a competitive workforce as restrictions ease?
Yeah, this is a very good question, actually. And I think one of the biggest challenges in the sector at the moment is this, as Kate said, the quality of staff and their well-being as well. These are the two major factors that. Here in the UK, the NDNA survey that I mentioned before concludes, and I quote, sorry about that the evidence is clear that high quality staff, motivated, well qualified and with access to good CPD opportunities are key to supporting children's early development. And the survey also presented that early years staff with the highest levels of qualifications were least likely to be furloughed during the furlough program here in the UK or made redundant. And that shows how important the owners consider that these qualified people are for the nursery settings. To keep the workforce competitive though, government will have to show their support to the sector financially, because we have lots of settings here that are struggling a lot. And it is a sector, as we know, with high workloads, low salaries, and mostly now, as Kate said, this is not something that motivates people to stay. So there is mobility, there is people going, like in the States that you mentioned. So during COVID-19 times, there is also a decrease in parents' fees and in government-funded places, because here we have that too. For some early year settings, income is still below pre-pandemic levels. And there is a reduction in demand for new places as well from parents, and that has led to reducing staffing costs. So should the demand rise, though, if things get a lot better and parents get more confident to send their children in, this loss of staff that has happened will be a problem, and finding new staff will be difficult, qualified staff, or even unqualified, to be fair. It already was an issue before the pandemic to find staff. We were struggling a lot to find new qualified people. So imagine now with all of the things happening. Also during the pandemic, there was a link between the early years sector and allowing parents to work. So it was this message that these two are linked together. But this sector is so much more than that for both their children and their families, in terms of, as Kate mentioned, their well-being. And this should be seriously taken into consideration as we go forward. The sector organisations here in the UK are asking for a recovery and transformation fund that will help the sector to go on. And here in the UK, we have a big change coming from September. So our development matters, which is the main thing that we are using in early years, has changed for us. So from September, it will be our guide forward. So practitioners should get some form of training for that too. and mostly for the unqualified staff, they should get some form of training, as I said, even online, or that should that the practitioners will be able to learn how things will be from now on. Changes include less paperwork and less time away from the children, which is the most important for me. It was important even before the pandemic, but now I think it has become essential. Children need much more time with their key workers, their key persons. They need that stability. And there is a clearer emphasis now on the prime areas of learning. Not that there wasn't before, but now it's even more. Since this is the foundation, I think, for any further learning to happen. And in prime areas, we mean personal, social, and emotional development, physical development, and communication and language, which is the main areas for us here in the UK. There is also a clear reference in terms such as transitions and self-regulation as being important as well. So our lives are packed with transitions, even as adults. And for children, it is even harder to be ready for those transitions. So self-regulation, which is the children's ability to regulate their emotions, thoughts, and behavior in order to be able to act in positive ways towards a goal, is crucial. For me, it always was. But we will keep observing children and finding ways to help their development and develop their learning. So practitioners now will have more, I think will be even more focused on that and have a more stimulating environment for them. So training new people will be really important to come into nurseries and help during these times, and help children as well, and the families as well.
Thank you. If I can move the discussion on now to focus on the career development of those working in early years, how has the pandemic affected the career development of those working in the early years industry, and what can be done to address this? Konstantina, if I can come to you first.
Yes, of course. So due to the situation after COVID-19, the disruption in the sector and the financial instability, as I mentioned before, there are less opportunities for high qualified staff to progress through the sector. As we mentioned before, the fact that settings have treasured in a way those qualified staff, there is less need now for these roles, and there is an increasing demand for unqualified and bank staff that will come in and help when there are staff away during this pandemic. The financial uncertainty also makes the setting owners think about priorities, and salaries of unqualified staff or bank staff are definitely lower. So they're much more affordable in a way during these challenging times for the sector. But it is also about predicting the unpredictable for the settings. Will they have a demand in new places for the next, from September, let's say? Will they have the same number of children enrolled as during pre-pandemic times? Is there going to be another surge of cases? So many questions. Will some parents decide to keep children at home or reduce the hours they spend in the settings? So there are so many questions obviously to be answered, and very much linked to the career development of those working in early years and the future of the sector in general. So I think there needs to be more encouragement for families to send their children in, and settings need to provide that reassurance and that safety as much as possible. There needs to be a general wave of informing the society as well about the huge importance of early years in the children's development. The new generation, the future of the country in general. So helping the sector financially is also extremely important, as we said, and that will give a prospect to settings. And some of them will think of expanding, and possibly that will create more opportunities for career development for qualified staff.
Thank you. And what is your view, Kate?
I think that's a really interesting question. And much like Konstantina, there is so much uncertainty. There is uncertainty around staffing. There is uncertainty around how many children are coming into our education and care services. There is uncertainty about ongoing funding. There is uncertainty about pay parity. In Australia, there's a very live conversation happening between degree qualified teachers in prior to school settings, those are the early childhood education and care settings, versus our colleagues, our degree qualified teachers in school settings, and whether there should be pay parity. So there are lots of uncertainties. And I think certainly as we're looking at this whole idea of career development in a time of uncertainty is particularly challenging. And we have to acknowledge that that's a huge issue. I'm particularly concerned about career development for our underprivileged colleagues. I come from a relatively high socioeconomic area. I'm fortunate to have food on my plate and in my fridge and electricity. But I'm quite concerned internationally about our children, our girls, in particular our girls, who are at most risk. And there's been some quite concerning reports recently about girls not being able to attend schools, and that there was a very high level of change during COVID, with an increase as much of 65% of girls having less access to schools. Now, you're probably thinking, why is she talking about girls and schools? Because I think when we look at career development, we need to look at our most disadvantaged communities as well as our most advantaged communities. You know, in Australia, for me, if I wanted to go and study further, I could do that. But if I lived in Africa, would I be able to at this point in time? And the answer is probably not. It's likely that my schooling has been interrupted, and so my career trajectory is also interrupted. And I really have to acknowledge, particularly in Southeast Asia, and Australasia more generally, that some of those communities are particularly struggling at this time. So when we think about career development and opportunities, that there are some real challenges. Having said that, there are some incredible silver linings as well. One of those is that educators have been able to access online a range of presenters, speakers, professional learning opportunities that they might not have been able to have normally. For example, we know of organisations who've had presentations from international researchers so that the whole service could come and join a live event and hear from the world's leaders in research, because we know that link between research and practice is so important. Now, traditionally, you might have been able to have one member of staff go to that training, but now, given that so much of it is online, there is a little bit of a silver lining there. I can also recognise that there's a silver lining occurring around how the rest of the community perceives our early childhood and education and care workers. In Australia, at least, as children have been staying at home, there has been a significant acknowledgement of the importance of the early years, and an acknowledgement of how this is such a seminal time for brain development and how hard our colleagues work in these spaces. So I think the public perception piece and the opportunities piece is something we need to focus on. I'm very much a positivist in that sense, whilst also understanding that these have been very challenging times, particularly for our most vulnerable communities.
Thank you. If we can now move on to focus on certain challenges students have been facing during this pandemic. Kate, if I can turn to you first. Due to the pandemic, some students are being restricted in some of their normal job activities, and some are struggling to generate evidence. How do we overcome this?
And at the moment, I just want to clarify, I'm speaking about pre-service teachers. So student teachers, students who are learning to be educators, to be teachers, and they could be at any level of their qualification, whether they're looking for a degree qualification or a certificate. And there are all different level systems, so I won't talk about the levels because internationally they're hard to translate. I recognise that. It's a really interesting piece. If you were studying to be a teacher in Australia and you lived in Melbourne, which is the state that, or the the capital city that had the longest period of lockdown, then almost all of those services did not allow student teachers in their service. So they just said for a period of time, approximately 100 days, no student teachers into the services. And then because of the increased healthcare checks, because of increased concern about bringing extra adults into services, visitors, etc., there are many services that haven't been taking their usual number of professional experience students. So even finding a place to do your practice teaching, we call it prac teaching. I'm not sure if that's what you guys would call it too, but finding a place to do those placements has been really challenging. While some places have been doing some innovative things, such as learning online, or student teachers shadowing the teacher as they did learning online, we have to acknowledge that there's been some real challenges. And in both Australia and in New Zealand, where they've had a similar lockdown for about 6 weeks, or some areas had more than that, but as a whole nation, we recognise that the time on placement has been really hard. Meeting those requirements around number of hours and number of days has been significantly challenging. We're also seeing that while the student teacher might have been allowed in, their assessor might not have been allowed in. And in Australia, most of the time the student teacher goes in and they have a teacher supervisor in the service, and then they have a university or training organisation assessor who comes and checks that they're meeting their competencies and their requirements. So even if the student teacher has been in working away, sometimes the assessor has not been able to come in. And that's been particularly challenging. And things like Zoom and video observations have become a more common element as we move forward. However, I have to say I'm hesitant about that. I know it can work amazingly well in some places, but in others it's really hard. For example, there are areas of Australia with very limited internet access, and certainly if we go into other countries around the world where being able to zoom in and out like this might not be possible. I also recognise that if I was zooming into a classroom as we speak, that I might not be able to see all of the nuances going on that we need to observe as we're watching students and assessing their practices. So I think that while we can see pockets of innovation, there are some real challenges in this space. And if you're a student teacher at the moment, my goodness, I feel for you because it's a hard time to get that experience, isn't it? Konstantina, I'd love to hear from you about how you found it in your nursery and what's happened.
Yes. And as you said, Kate, there are so many levels here as well in terms of how you go into the workforce. So you do PGC, which is a postgraduate certificate. You might do a level 3, as we said before. You might do a university degree. So there are all these different kinds of and different students that want to go in. But yes, here as well, as you said, we're using internet a lot, and students will have the opportunity through the internet to do things. But this is not always the case, as you said. Some do not have access. It's not very easy. And it is true that the policies in settings have changed, and they're not allowing certain activities to happen, restricting others, and that this might be an issue for students that need to produce evidence of time in the nursery. There is also the restriction of people coming in settings to observe those students, as you mentioned. It's the same here. Hopefully, now, because we have the vaccination program going really fast and people feel more safe in a way to invite people in, that might slightly change. Settings need to have strong health and safety policies in order to allow that to happen. It will be easier though for large settings, I think, and for possibly for chains, I'm sorry. But we also need to take small settings into consideration and see what can be done to help those more now. There is also a need to give alternatives to those students in terms of generating evidence of their work, maybe considering more activities outside, for nurseries who have that space. We are very lucky in our nursery, and we have this amazing garden space that children enjoy, and this can be a way to go. Also, there can be peer observations as well as observations from managers of settings that might also help. And specifically for students actually in early years that have to do their training on site while working in settings, because we have colleagues who have started working and then as they go along, they start their level 3, let's say, inside the nursery. So it's safe for them to come, but not for the assessors to come. And there are some changes as well in assessment methodologies. There are, for example, as we already mentioned, there is regular testing when assessors visit the nurseries, prioritizing observing students outdoors, as we said, during their visits, maybe creating a bubble where we can use only one assessor for each setting rather than for each student specifically, in order to minimize that risk of different people coming in. So you have one specific person coming all the time, at least. And if in any case employers feel that direct observations are not safe, then there can be what is called the expert witness testimonies, as we call it. These experts need to be competent in the area of knowledge, to have working knowledge of the units that are taught, having any qualification in assessment, or even having a work role which involves evaluating the everyday practice of the staff. And some students also here were helped by carrying maybe work placement hours from their previous qualification. So if they had more working hours, let's say for the level 2, they can move those hours to the level 3 to cover that time. And there is also, as you mentioned, technology, remote technology, but here in the UK, it can only be used for online meetings, planning, and remote activities. So the assessor can be online with the student and do all those things. And there can also be some voice and audio recordings of that student.
It's interesting you mentioned the recordings option. We're seeing a lot more of that happening as evidence of practice with families who have allowed recording of their child. Then the student teacher is recording their practice maybe with a small group or in a one-to-one context, or very carefully recording so that they're not obtaining people with who have not given permission. And we're seeing some really interesting practice happening there that probably wouldn't have been permitted in the past. And so I do see that there's some innovation occurring around that. But it relies on you having the technology, having access to a supervisor who can use the technology, having really good internet connection to upload your content, secure internet connection to do that. There's a lot of processes. And I think, Lucy, you mentioned that students are doing 30 hours a week in a service. It then takes time to do all of these extra pieces. So I do think for student teachers that this is a really challenging additional load, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so many things they have to do on top of working. Yes.
If we can now move on to focus on the assessment methodologies in the future. Kate, if I can come to you first this time. Based on what we've learnt during the pandemic, how do you think assessment methodologies may change in the near future and beyond?
Thank you, Lucy. I think some of the things we're talking about here have already been mentioned. Remember, of course, that assessment has a purpose. Assessment is how we provide evidence of our competencies. Assessment is how we reflect on our own practice and gives us that chance to really improve what we're doing. Assessment shouldn't just be an imposed activity that you don't have any control over, but should be one that you are actually an active participant in, or at least for me, that is the case. There is decades of research on what makes good assessment. For example, assessment is not a right, wrong, yes, no answer. Assessment has to provide feedback and has to give indication of how to progress practice further. I'm happy to talk about that for a long time, but I know that's not the subject of today. And so I want to say that as we move forward following the pandemic in terms of assessment practices, I'd like us to draw on the elements of innovation, such as using technology, and that's obviously a big part of my research. But I'd like us to move forward carefully in a way that doesn't add extra load to the student teacher or add extra load to the service or add extra stress. If you're 19, I guarantee you've got a phone or two, and so recording yourself teaching is probably not going to be too stressful. Well, that's not true. It's always stressful to record yourself, especially in practice. But in terms of that practice of recording, it might not be too difficult. But if you are 68 and you've only just started using a smartphone, then that might be an extra load on your practice that's really hard. And it means that you're so focused on that process, that modality of assessment, that is using the technology, that maybe you won't be teaching in the way that you are truly capable of. And when we think about this whole piece of workforce, employment, keeping great staff, we have to recognise that sometimes our most skilled staff with children are sometimes the least skilled staff with technology. So as I think about assessment processes, I'd like us to move carefully. I'd like us to draw on the research of what makes a good assessment piece. And I'd like us to work in a way that we're truly assessing the teacher or the student teacher rather than assessing their technological skills. Does that make sense? I'm sure we'll keep chatting about this as we go along. So I'd love to hear from you, Konstantina. Sorry, Lucy, I'm doing your job for you. You're meant to ask that.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Kate. I think what you said about defining assessment is really important, yes, because there in our sector, mostly it's like really too many things that you can put into that. So the way forward for assessment methodologies is definitely technology, as you said, in general, and more specifically, I think emerging technologies, embracing those emerging technologies. Here in the UK, there was an interesting report from universities, from a number of universities in the UK, that contains 5 targets for the next 4 or 5 years, let's say, as far as assessment is concerned. So they talk about different ways of doing that and how important it is to get those goals. So they talk about assessments designed to prepare students for what they do next using technology that they will use in their careers. So let's say, for example, for us in the early years, we have specific programs that we use when we do the observations and we send that material to parents. So maybe having that experience of using or getting familiar with those tools as you study, it can help you later on for when you go into the workforce. So you are more prepared, let's say, in a way for that. Their second target was assessments that are first and foremost easily accessible, which is really important, as you said, with the internet, like, or finding them very easily online, because there are vast variety of things that you can find. Then there is also having a balance between human marking and automated marking for the best interests of the students as well. Assessment data used to explore opportunities for continuous assessment to improve the learning experience of students. And finally, create secure ways of assessment. It's really important as well. And here we're using also e-portfolios that are considered very valued, and they're helpful, and they're a good way, I think, to see the students' progress. And it's like a viable thing because you can add things as you go along, and it's a good way for students to see the feedback of the assessors, I think, and for the assessors to see what the students are doing and what they are adding on it. And assessment with immediate results are found to be definitely much more pleasurable for students, since they do not have to wait for the feedback from the teachers or for the grading in sometimes, but they can see it straight away on their screen. I think it is of great importance for teachers and learners to come together to develop their digital literacy. Because as you said, some people don't have that, and it's really important to get that. Teachers will need much more training in that sense in order to be able to help students become more confident as well. And or the other way around sometimes, because students might know more than the teachers nowadays. And starting from the teachers and then going to the students, or the other way around, as we said, building the foundation for digital skills to flourish in general. Building that is really important for the future.
It's almost a whole community approach, isn't it? We need to upskill the teachers in the services, yes, upskill the students, as well as look at the universities. The other thing I think about here is that I want to have more evidence about what works and what doesn't work. There's been some really interesting work, for example, by Chan, Dillard and Tico that came out in October last year, which had case studies of practice. And then, of course, there was the work of Kim that looked at pre-service teachers. But I feel like we need more research to know what these assessment practices are, how have they impacted on the teachers as they supervised, and particularly what's been the impact on student teachers in terms of their experience. Because if we can take the benefits from this without taking the challenges, that would be an incredible piece for us. So I guess I'm calling on our researchers, if there's any researchers watching, to band together and do more of those reports, like you mentioned, from the universities in the UK.
I think there will be lots and lots in the future, because we're like, it's just the beginning now, let's say, in a way. So as we go along, as we move along, hopefully there will be lots and lots of that research. Yes, you're right.
And I'm really hoping that they also capture the student-teacher experience, rather than just being about the academics and what worked for them. We really need the student-teacher voice, and maybe even the child's voice, as the child had those visiting students as well. Oh, that could be interesting.
Yes, because to share very quickly, my experience from one of my children, we were doing junk modeling, and he made that robot Jack, as he called it. And he told me he's learning now how to express his emotions. He's into that. So through Jack, he started telling me how he feels, I think. That's how I got it. So he said, Jack doesn't like new people. So he said, and then I said, sometimes it's okay. Sometimes I don't like new people. And he asked, so what do you do? And that was like the question, like, what do you do? He was looking for that information. And I said, sometimes I sit back a little bit, I look at them. If I see that they are nice, they're kind, they smile, then I go to them, I introduce myself and let them introduce themselves. And then they're not new anymore. I become familiar with them. And he just went, yeah. And that was it. So as you said, getting the children into that, how they feel with new people coming in, with students coming in, is very important, very important.
And I think even more so at this time, there is considerable research that when children see traumatic events on television, that they can experience that trauma themselves. And if we look at some of the video footage that children may have been exposed to in this time, it's very likely that they are going to be scared of people. A mask occludes many of our abilities to read emotion and engagement. So if they've been in services where masks are worn, especially by visitors, then the experience of the child in this moment is very different. Our goal is to do this for children. Student teachers want to learn to be teachers because they want to work with children. We want the best environments for children, for their neurological development, for their brain development, their whole child development. There's so much we want for our children. And so recognizing the impact on children here is so important. And that story is such a key to that, Konstantina.
I completely agree, Kate, with you, yes.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our discussion, and on behalf of App Education Online, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our panel, Konstantina and Kate, We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience on how this pandemic has and could affect the early years sector. Thank you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks all.